Professor Steve Friedman, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
No, thank you.
Let me start right away with the first question. As a signatory to the declaration published on June 13, 2025, which invokes the history of 1925 Italy to characterize contemporary authoritarian populism globally, how persuasive do you find this analogy for understanding authoritarian threats in post-colonial contexts such as South Africa, particularly in the light of your own critique of applying northern paradigms to southern democracies?
Yeah. Look, I think before I answer directly, just a word about that critique you mentioned. What I'm trying to do in that critique is not close down, but open up. In other words, I don't want to be misunderstood as one of those voices which say, you know, we don't want to learn anything from the global north, only what happens in the global south matters. And then you get a whole lot of essentialism about what is really authentically African or Asian or whatever the case may be. My concern has always been that a particular way of thinking and a particular experience has been foisted on the rest of us. But that certainly doesn't mean that that experience is irrelevant. I wrote a long article on a couple of years ago on decolonization, in which I made the point that decolonization was not excluding voices from the global north. It was adding voices from the global south to those voices. So, as you correctly say, fascism was an Italian experience about literally a century ago. But it's an experience which I think is relevant for us today. I think that we are passing through a moment or a period globally where the extinguishing of or severely weakening of existing democracies is certainly a global concern at the moment on all the continents. And therefore, I think that it's appropriate. It happened to be, of course, built around the anniversary of the Intellectuals Declaration. But I don't think the fact that it happened in Italy in the 1920s excludes the fact that it speaks to a reality today which affects us just as it affects everybody else.
Right. The declaration calls on intellectuals, artists, and scholars to act as a bulwark against authoritarianism. From your perspective on intellectual responsibility in transitional societies, what forms of scholarly engagement are most ethically and politically effective in confronting democratic erosion today?
Yeah, I think just one point. It was probably quite normal to talk about us as transitional societies 10 or 15 years ago. Today, I'm not quite sure that that's appropriate, because I think that right now, just about everywhere are transitional societies, where we're at a moment in which those certainties, which, as you correctly point out, I've written a great deal of, I've criticized a great deal in my own writing, that sense that, that idea that there are democracies which have made it, and there are democracies which are still trying to make it, and there are democracies which are secure and democracies are not secure. All of that is no longer appropriate. There are very few places in the world, for some reason, Costa Rica and Botswana spring to mind, of countries who probably aren't under great threat at the moment. But it's a problem just about everywhere else. And therefore, I think what I'm going to say applies generally. I think it is very important if scholars and intellectuals want to play around in that, and this is fairly trite, but I think it's forgotten, is that you cannot play that role in the classroom or the library alone. You have to be willing to become part of the public debate. And I think once you're willing to become part of the public debate, you also have to give consideration to obvious strategic questions like, are you talking down to people? Are you saying things which appear to be insensitive to people's circumstances? Are you assuming that because you happen to have read many books and they haven't, that you are superior to other people? So I think it's very important to be part of the public debate, and it's very important to be part of the public debate in ways which at least open conversations rather than close them down, because I'm afraid intellectuals very often tend to be guilty of, yes, well, of course I participated in the public debate. I explained to them why they were all wrong and I was right. Well, you don't have to be a psychology doctorate to work out that that's going to offend people. So there is and I think the more also that intellectuals can be engaged with, I have to be very careful the way I phrase this. I'm talking about being engaged with citizens' organizations, with citizens, and I certainly don't mean, because that has been a problem also, becoming an uncritical messenger of everything a particular organization or a particular group of organizations have to say. But I think it's very important to keep channels open to organizations and to be available to engage with them. I'm certainly not making the argument, I'm aware of the limits of intellectuals' role here, but I think on the other hand, we need not to underestimate the role of intellectuals. You can go from the one extreme of believing that you have more power than you have, to, I think, the equally misguided view, well, ideas don't matter, only power matters. And I don't think that's true either.
Right. A key theme of the declaration is the defense of facts and evidence in a climate of disinformation. Given your critique of how elite-driven narratives often delegitimize popular grievances, how can intellectuals defend epistemic rigor without reinforcing social exclusion or epistemic inequality?
Well, I think that my critique of those elite narratives are precisely because they ignore evidence and argument. If they were accurately reflecting the evidence, then I wouldn't be criticizing them. Very often, what you see is simply a repetition of various prejudices, which are then closed as evidence and argument. So we're talking about the field of democracy, for example. I mean, I'll give you a concrete example of a paradigm which was very influential and probably still is influential, even though people don't use the words as much anymore, which I have written a great deal about, and that is democratic consolidation. And for quite a few years, scholars wrote, researched, and published on democratic consolidation, as though it was quite clear what that concept meant, that it was firmly grounded in evidence and argument. Some years ago, I subjected this to a great deal of critical examination and discovered that, which is quite remarkable in scholarship, if you think about it, that this term, which was bandied around for years and years, was never coherently defined by anybody. If you're not familiar, at one stage, there were some very eminent scholars who said, well, a democracy is consolidated when it's the only game in town. Well, if you start looking at that very carefully, it's a very vague, untestable notion of how to determine whether your democracy is consolidated or not. I think it's very important to stress here that there are, a lot of my work is about criticizing the way in which, what I consider to be, global North views of the world are simply imposed on us. But that never means that evidence and argument are unimportant. It means that evidence and argument are more important than ever. And it means that we have to be alert to the extent to which conventional wisdoms of a very rarefied sort, those which dominate the academy, are not based on evidence and argument. And therefore, I would argue that everything I've been saying about bias, but what some people call a Western bias, a global North bias, has really been an argument for evidence and argument. And so I don't see any contradiction between the two. And I think it it's obviously a very pressing concern. I'm not one of those who believe that that somehow digital media, and I insist on calling them digital media because social media strikes me as a very odd term for very large, well-resourced corporations who are selling us a product. But I know that there are those who insist that digital media somehow have some great force which is changing our lives. I think what is changing our lives is simply that they're repeating and amplify, that those media are able to amplify prejudices and amplify misrepresentations. And centuries ago, people used to burn women because they said they were witches, which was based on all sorts of, very much the kind of rumor that we come across today, and the misrepresentation we come across today. But it tended to happen in small, concentrated communities. I mean, today, if you want to put a lie into the world, you can get it to literally millions of people in the space of only a few minutes. And that is a tremendous challenge. And I think it's a challenge everywhere. But I certainly don't think that the problem is, that there's something culturally biased about evidence and argument. I think quite the contrary. I think the cultural biases tend to eliminate evidence and argument, or certainly weaken it.
Right. The declaration warns against authoritarian leaders claiming an unlimited popular mandate. In your scholarship, you have emphasized democratizing participation rather than limiting it. How would you suggest navigating the tension between majoritarian legitimacy and the protection of pluralism?
Well, the majoritarianism tends to exclude public participation. I mean, to put it bluntly, that's what's wrong with it. Because the majoritarian populism says, well, we won an election, so we have an unlimited mandate to do what we like for the next 5 years. In some cases, obviously, they manipulate the system to make sure that it's a lot more than 5 years. So that right now in the US, which is the example which is obviously concerning people around the world, you have a situation in which a president who, let us remind ourselves, didn't actually get a majority of the popular vote in a system in which the popular vote doesn't actually get you elected, telling everybody that he has a right to tear up the Constitution because he had an overwhelming mandate from the public. In my work, I've made it absolutely clear that part of the reason we need participation is precisely because those electoral mandates are very limited. I've made the point, I'm not the first person to make it, that, you could probably count the number, in multi-party democracies, you could probably count the number of people who agree with everything that the party they vote for stands for on the fingers of one hand. We all tend to look at our options and say, well, this one's closest to what I want, and therefore I will support them. So, once you've established the point that people tend to vote for parties without necessarily agreeing with everything they stand for, then any policy of a party, any legislative initiative, cannot assume public support simply because people voted for the party. You have to demonstrate that public support. You have to go out and seek that public support, and that's that's the start of the notion of participation. So, the problem with the majoritarianism, which the statement, quite in my view, quite rightly rejects, is precisely that it the problem is not that old cliche, the tyranny of the majority. The problem is elites claiming that because they have an electoral mandate, they therefore have a blank check to decide what should be law and what shouldn't. I mean, obviously, the other point which occurs is that in electoral cycles being what they are, even if they're only 2 years as they are in a couple of countries, an awful lot can happen between the election and the next election. An awful lot can happen which the government doesn't have a mandate because it deals with circumstances which didn't exist at the time of the election. So no, I think I mean one of the points I need to stress, which is why I thought that was a very appropriate part of the statement, is that I've been struck for a long time, and hopefully it's been clear in some of what I've written, that we need rules, we need constitutions, we need power to be subjected to constraints, because if power is not subjected to constraints, then it's inevitable that power does as it pleases. So these kind of utopian democratic experiments in which there are no rules tend to become authoritarian very quickly.
Right. In equating today's far-right movements with fascism, is there a danger of universalizing European historical experiences at the expense of recognizing the structural drivers of discontent in context of ongoing inequality, such as South Africa and other post-colonial states?
Well, there's certainly dangers, and the dangers, I think you've put your finger on something important here. On its own, no. I think I answered that earlier. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that if, for example, by signing a statement which refers to fascism, that I or anybody else is saying, well, only the European experience of a century ago is instructive. We're simply saying that is one of the experiences which is instructive. And I think the danger that you put your finger on is that what we're experiencing at the moment is seen, which I think it is seen by many, probably by most mainstream scholars at the moment, as some kind of intrusion, that a democracy which was serving people's interests well is now under threat. I think that is assumed by many people. And I would argue very strongly, and you mentioned inequality. Inequality is a very important part of what I'm concerned about. It wasn't a democracy which was serving us well. And I'm not talking about democracy. I obviously wouldn't have signed the statement if I didn't believe that democracy served us well. But I think what we're witnessing at the moment is a challenge, unfortunately, a challenge from anti-democrats rather than from more zealous Democrats, to a form of democracy which didn't really address people's needs, because it was an attenuated form of democracy. It was a much more attenuated form of democracy than the kind of democracy which was dominant in the global north in the decades after World War II. Because what it was, on the theoretical level, was a model of democracy which said the only relationship which matters if you're concerned about constraining power is that between the citizen and the state. So that you have citizens and you have states, and states must be constrained by democratic process, all of which is true, and all of which I agree with very strongly. But then it totally ignores private power, because private power exists, and private power is a problem. And if you don't regulate private power, you have what we have today, because a very important ingredient in what is wrong with what we have today starkly illustrated in the global north, but certainly an issue in our countries in the global south, is just huge concentrations of economic power in the hands of a few individuals, which is not an inevitable part of the system. Post-war European societies, not necessarily, I mean, mainly social democratic, but even the German social market economy, which was quite a conservative idea, recognized the need to constrain private power. So when Elon Musk spends $250 million getting Donald Trump elected, that is a result of a model of democracy which says, you can say what you like as long as you only say it to government, as long as you don't insist on regulating private power. Another interesting insight, because it's obviously a major concern of mine. If we look at all the analyses of what happened in America, I mean, one of the findings which has got very little attention, I think is very significant, and that is that in the last American election, Democratic Party candidates, obviously Republicans wouldn't do this, Democratic Party candidates who campaigned on a ticket of reining in private power in some way, I mean, whether it was competition legislation or dealing with prices or whatever the case may be, on the whole did about 8 percentage points better than those who didn't. And you had strange phenomena of people, which they couldn't explain originally, of, in a year in which the Republicans were dominated, Democrats getting elected in Midwestern states, etc. And the reason for that, it turned out, is that they were actually speaking to people's concerns. They were saying, look, you're entitled, if your medical aid is not looking after you, you're entitled to redress, etc., etc. So I think the danger of using, to get, to bring that back to your initial question, the danger of using this model uncritically is that then you say, well, we had this fine democracy which was available to everybody, and then the bad people came and tried to take away from us. And I think that unless we realize that one of the reasons why statements like that had to be issued in the first place is that that model is being rejected. Not incidentally, but that's going into detail, which I guess is important. I mean, another myth about what's happening at the moment, which I'm concerned about, is that large numbers of people are suddenly being won over to authoritarian and anti-democratic ideas. In just about every country I can think of, there may be a couple of exceptions. I mean, that's not really what's happening at all. What's happening more prominently is that very many people who support democratic ideals are so alienated by this very attenuated form of democracy that they don't bother to participate. So that you have, and that gets back to your question about majoritarianism, because certainly the problem is not, as some critiques of majoritarianism tell us, the problem here is not an illiberal mass dictating to a liberal elite or a liberal intelligentsia. The problem is that the people who would support very strongly a robust democracy of not being taken seriously and being alienated, and just feel that their voice isn't heard. To get back to that American election, simply because it has been seen as such a watershed. The Republicans didn't win that election; the Democrats lost it. And the point I'm making, it's been pretty much the reason the Republicans won is that 19 million Democrats who voted for the ticket in 2020 didn't vote this time around. So obviously you were dealing with a huge amount of discontent in the Democratic camp. And if we don't acknowledge that, well, then, democracy is in even more trouble than it is already.
Right. The declaration's robust defense of multilateralism aligns with the liberal internationalist vision. How should scholars reconcile this with postcolonial critiques of global governance institutions as sites of inequality and dependency, particularly from an African vantage point?
Well, from any vantage point, I mean, the problem is not that liberal internationalism, if we want to call it that, it's as good a name as any, is a bad idea. The problem is that it's not something which it's something which is honored in the breach. It's something which is talked about and not acted upon, which incidentally is another of the myths which I think we have to be concerned about today. Because the other myth is, once again, the anti-democrats are tearing up the international order. Well, one of the reasons they're tearing up the international order is that the self-proclaimed elite Democrats tore it up ages ago. So that, when the Russians invade Ukraine, you say, well, that's a breach of the rules-based international order. And of course, if we had a functioning rules-based international order, it would indeed be a breach, a very serious breach. The problem with that is not that anything the Russians did was justified, because it wasn't. The problem was that the double standard is quite obvious. Besides the oft-made point that apparently in the rules-based international order, you can bomb anybody, any civilians you like if they happen to be Palestinian. Besides that point, when Putin decimated Grozny in Chechnya, which was full of Russian Muslims, the rules-based international order had no problem with it. When his troops bombed Aleppo in Syria into the Stone Age, the rules-based international order didn't comply. When he attacked people who were white and European, suddenly the rules-based order was important. And the suspicion in Africa, as with everybody else, as in the rest of the global south, is not that we don't need a rules-based order. It is that the rules-based order only applies to some. Now, to take a specific example, which is very relevant to Africa, which is the International Criminal Court. Now, in principle, the idea of an international court which intervenes when states won't prosecute human rights abuses is an excellent idea. But we all know that up until very recently, the court was only used to prosecute Africans. I think there was one exception, which was Bosnia, Radovan Karadzic and the Serbs, etc. But overwhelmingly, it was used to prosecute Africans, despite the fact that there was plentiful evidence that there were war criminals who were not African. And of course, now we have a situation in which there has been an attempt by the ICC to become more of what it's supposed to become, and that attempt is frustrated. So that when they issue arrest warrants for people who the northern elites like, then sanctions are imposed on the International Criminal Court. Now, clearly, there was nobody gave the name, but there was at one stage when the Israeli and Hamas accused were indicted by the International Criminal Court. Apparently, it was widely reported without a name that one fairly prominent politician had said, but the International Criminal Court is only for Africans and thugs like Putin. Well, it's a very obvious point, which I made 100 times. If ever you or I were living in a country in which it was quite clearly stated that the law applies to some people and not other people, we wouldn't consider that acceptable. Now, I'm speaking from a certain amount of personal experience because, in fact, up until 1994, I did live in a country in which there was one law for some people and another law for the other people. But fortunately, after a great deal of cajoling, international opinion said that was unacceptable. So the problem with, I was quite happy to sign a statement saying that the international rules-based order was in trouble, because I think it's in more than trouble. But obviously, not all of the signatories would no doubt agree on what precisely the trouble is and how it ought to be fixed. And my own view is that, we need, if we don't have international law which applies to everybody equally, then we don't have international law. It's a very straightforward proposition.
Right. And Professor Friedman, lastly, do you see a distinctively South African form of authoritarian populism emerging today? If so, how would you differentiate it analytically from global trends, given your emphasis on the rootedness of South African democratic struggles in racial and economic inequality?
Yeah, it's a huge problem here today, yes. And let me say, something else about this question of, global experiences and the influence of certain ideas and influence of certain ways of seeing the world. I read a book on COVID-19 a couple of years, just after the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And essentially the argument of the book is that we failed in this country to deal with COVID-19 because we insisted on dealing with it exactly the same way as the Americans and the Europeans did, which was a rather odd approach, given that the Americans and Europeans had the worst infection rates and fatality rates in the world. That it would have seemed rather more rational to be looking at what the South Koreans were doing, given that they had some of the lowest rates in the world. And the point I'm trying to make through that is to say, I'm certain, a lot of what gets said in a country like South Africa repeats what is said in the global north. So the global north has a huge impact on the thinking of people. And the result of that is that a lot of the authoritarian populism we have, interestingly enough, in a very different environment, does imitate that. There's a particular aspect which doesn't, and I'll come to that in a moment. But what does imitate it is, first of all, in this country at the moment, and very much in common with large sections of the global north, immigration and attitudes to immigration have become a very serious threat to democracy. In a sense, it's been, just to illustrate the point, but anecdotally, I was invited a while ago to give a talk on this issue at the Human Rights Commission, which is a body which exists in this country to promote human rights. And I made the point to the audience there that I'd driven about 20 minutes to this meeting, and I'd had my car radio on, listening to current affairs radio. In the course of a 20-minute journey, I heard what amounted to attacks on immigrants about 30 times in 20 minutes. Okay, you'd be amazed at how people could drag in, to the most obviously seemingly unrelated issues, would suddenly say, "Oh no, well the problem is the term that's used here is foreign nationals. Foreign nationals are the problem." So it's a tremendous problem here in the sense that once again it's used in all sorts of ways to undermine democratic values, and is incidentally particularly bizarre in our country and in our continent. And the reason it's particularly bizarre in our country and our continent is that the difference, for example, between a South African and a Zimbabwean, which is one of our northern neighbors, is which side of a boundary drawn at the Berlin Conference you happen to be on. So we've suddenly decided, or large sections of society have decided, that somehow a person born on one side of a colonial border is not welcome on the other side, even if they're a perfectly law-abiding citizen simply doing their jobs, which is a particularly odd prejudice, and probably reinforces, one of the views I made, as I'm saying, time and time in my writing, is that a lot of those attitudes of northern superiority, which I criticize, are entirely absorbed and imbibed by people in the global south. And this is another example. The other, there are, okay, the other element of this, which I think mirrors part of what we see in the global north, and it's being played out as it happens in this country right today as I speak to you, is that we've had a rather bizarre situation here in which we're probably the only country in the world, the only democratic country in the world that I can think of, and I'm talking from personal experience, where people can tell you that you're being brave if you mildly defend the government. Okay. If you write something which says that maybe the government isn't as bad as we say it is, people say, well, that's very brave, surely, it must be very. And the reason for that is that we have this rather bizarre culture, and there are all sorts of interesting reasons for it, in which among about 30% of the population, which is the 30% which tends to get listened to in political debate, to say anything about the government which is complimentary is, you get ridiculed and people hurl abuse and stuff like that. Now, on one level, it's always better to have a citizenry which is suspicious of the government than a citizenry which is compliant. But in our particular context, it's a problem. And the reason that it's a problem is that because, and once again, similarly to some of the patterns in the global north, we have the official opposition in this country at the moment is a political party whose manifesto wants to abolish the Constitution. And they want to abolish the Constitution precisely because they don't like the democratic freedoms which it contains. Now, because there is, so it's a very interesting phenomenon, because there is this pervasive cynicism and hostility to government, what the anti-democrats know is that if you really want to bring down a democratic politician, if you're really threatened by a democratic politician, what you do is you make corruption claims against that person. Now, it doesn't matter whether the corruption claims are true or not, because the public debate decides that they're true. So to be quite specific, sorry to be that specific, but it illustrates the point. So what we're dealing with at the moment is that a week ago, a senior police officer in one of the provinces gave a media conference in which he claimed that a whole range of senior politicians and judges, etc., were corrupt and were involved in corrupt activity. Now, he didn't give any supporting evidence. And some of us found it rather interesting that he made these very wide-ranging allegations. He only mentioned two names. And the two names he mentioned were of the Minister of Police, who happens to be the leading candidate of the anti-populists group. In other words, the leading pro-constitution candidate. And he also named a senior police officer who fell foul of the populist president. So in other words, you take a politician and a police officer who are clearly pro-democratic, and you say, well, those are the criminals. Okay. Last night, the president announced a commission of inquiry into this and has been absolutely pilloried for the whole of today for announcing a commission of inquiry, because apparently what he should have done is, because the general says these people are guilty, they must be guilty, and he should have punished them instead of trying to get a judge to determine whether they're guilty or not. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that's very fertile field for anti-democrats, because really what it tells you is that all you have to do, is if you're worried about a particular politician, and a democratic politician or public figure, just invent corruption allegations against them. They don't have to be true. The public debate will accept them whether they're true or not. So that's the other danger. And then the final danger, which is a little bit, but as I think about it, perhaps even that's not so unique to us, is that it's the misuse, if I can put it this way, of what comes across as to use the term they would use, anti-imperialism. Okay, so this opposition party that I'm talking about, why do they want to abolish the Constitution? Because it's a Western imperialist tool. It's telling people that they've got to be subject to the rule of law, and telling people in power that they have to listen to what citizens have to say, is an invention by Western elites designed to enslave Africans, etc. And that is certainly a problem that we have to deal with. And incidentally, because you have raised that several times, and in my own view, is that this is a further illustration of why it is so important, which I've done repeatedly in my work, to make the point that democracy is not white and Western. Democracy is, there are certain aspects of democracy which are universal. I define democracy rather differently to many of my colleagues. In a fairly utopian way, I think that the perfect democracy would be a society in which each adult individual had an equal say in every decision which affected them. Now, obviously, no such society has ever existed, and probably none ever will, but it gives you a standard. And once you have that standard, well, then democracy can't possibly be exclusively white and Western, because it means everybody's got a right to an equal say in decisions. So, that argument has to be won here, because, it's a repeated refrain here. That we have this democracy which the Westerners imposed on us, and as soon as we get rid of democracy, we'll be fine. I just, to be anecdotal again, because I think it illustrates the point. I've served on a particular awards committee for several years now, in which we give awards to outstanding Africans. And I had a major debate with my colleagues the other day, because I was the minority of one, they wanted to give this award to a man who staged a military coup. And I said, sorry, I don't care whether he's written, made some fine speeches. If he's staged a military coup, he's out of the question. In the end, they accepted the point. But what I found interesting was, and these are not raving right-wing people by any manner of means. They're not authoritarian populists, etc. But I mean, the point I'm making is that the reason they wanted to give this man an award is that precisely that he'd said he wanted his country to be independent of Western influence, etc., etc. So this idea that it's somehow African to be anti-democratic is very much out there. It's something which we've got to resist. And I believe the way to resist it is to continually point out that democracy is for everybody. It's not just for white Western people.
Professor Steven Friedman, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Professor, may I kindly ask a picture of yours?
What, do you want me to send you a picture?
Yeah, can you send me a picture?
I'll email you. Yes.
Yes,
sure.
Please.
No problem at all.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
All the best.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.